If you want to make a gravy-type sauce without the use of wheat flour as a thickener, you have so many good options. Whether you're cooking for somebody with celiac disease or you just want to try some different textures, I'm going to show you a few experiments with some widely available things like cornstarch and arrowroot. Also, we'll examine some more exotic options like xanthan gum and agar-agar.
Please, agar-agar's my father. Call me Agar.
First, I think it'll help to just remind ourselves how starches thicken sauces in the first place. Let's get our Elton Brown on. The big white cotton balls there represent the water-based liquid that we're going to try to thicken. Could be meat drippings, could be dissolved fond, milk, wine, whatever. All the water molecules are spread out in a thin layer because there's not much holding them together. The sauce is loose, thin. Then we throw some starch into our sauce. These are tightly packed carbohydrate granules, little balls of sugar polymers that naturally occur in lots of plants, not just wheat. Then we apply some heat to the sauce. The starch granules unravel and explode. This is called gelatinization. Then you stir the mixture, and the exploded starches bond with the water, and everything gets tangled together in a big web that traps the water molecules in 3 dimensions. They're heaped up on top of each other now, and our sauce is thick. Thickeners can also keep fats from separating out of your sauce. If you add oil to your water-based sauce, it will naturally just float to the top in a grease layer because fat molecules are light and hydrophobic. But add some starch, then some heat, the granules explode, and the water and fat molecules alike are trapped in the same web together. It's not the most stable sauce ever, but starch does a pretty good job of keeping sauces from separating. Now, not all of these starches are the same. Some are little straight chains of glucose, that's amylose, and some are big branched chains of glucose called amylopectin. The primary practical difference between the various kinds of cooking starches is the relative proportion of amylose and amylopectin within them. They just have different properties in the pan depending on that relative proportion. Now, when you thicken a sauce with flour, the most common way you do it is by making a roux. You melt some butter into a pan, you stir in enough flour to make a paste, you cook it for a minute, maybe you let it brown depending on the flavor and color that you're after, then you gradually whisk in enough liquid to get the sauce consistency that you want, being sure to bring it to a boil, which is the temperature that wheat starch needs in order to gelatinize. However, the most common way that people thicken with alternative starches is with a slurry, and we'll start with cornstarch. Brits would call this corn flour, and that's technically more accurate. Flour is a grain, root, bean, etc. that has been ground up into a dry powder. It might be the whole grain, as in the case of whole wheat flour, or it might just be the white part of the grain, the endosperm, in the case of this stuff, which is white wheat flour. Regardless, flour has stuff in it other than just starch, most notably protein. Products that are sold as starch and not flour generally have only starch in there. The starch has been isolated from the other stuff via some kind of chemical or physical process. Cornstarch, despite its US name, is not refined, it's just white corn flour, but because corn endosperm naturally has so much more starch in it than anything else, it basically functions the way an isolated starch would. So I'm guessing that's why it's labeled as cornstarch in the States, even though that's technically wrong. Anyway, when people thicken with starches that aren't flour, they usually do it by means of a slurry. Gonna take a little bit of cornstarch, just put it into any kind of small container. I like to do it in a mason jar. And then you gotta mix in some liquid, and that liquid can't be hot. Basically equal parts starch and liquid, and then you could either mix that around really vigorously, or what you can do with a mason jar or any other lidded container is shake it up. Totally smooth. Then you just go over to the hot liquid that you're using for your sauce. I'm just using cartoned beef broth for all of these experiments. And you just stir in enough slurry to get the thickness that you want. Different starches gelatinize at different temperatures. Cornstarch does it at slightly less than a boil. The reason you do the slurry is to get the starch granules separated from each other. If you threw dry starch or flour directly into the hot liquid, it would clump up. Your sauce would be lumpy. That's one reason that we mix wheat flour into a roux, to get all of the granules dispersed in the fat away from each other so that they won't clump up when the liquid hits the pan. But you can also use a wheat flour slurry to thicken a sauce. That's what this is. The problem is that if you taste it, that sauce has an unpleasant raw flour taste, which is a real thing. You'd have to simmer this for a while to cook out that flavor, whereas if you cook flour in a roux, that raw taste goes away really, really fast. Cooking flour in a roux does two other things for you though. If you let it brown a bit, it gives your sauce a nice brown color, without using that bizarre gravy browning stuff that the Brits like to use. It's basically caramel water. Anyway, also, if you let your roux get really brown, it gives the sauce a toasty, caramelized flavor. This phenomenon is used to the max in Cajun food, a culinary tradition that is based on all of the different flavors and textures you can get by browning roux to varying extents. So, since roux tastes good, I've always wondered why people make a slurry with cornstarch instead of making a roux with it. Let's try. It's putting off some weird smells. Whisk in the broth, heat it up to gelatinize, and give it a taste. That has a kind of funny flavor to it, but frankly, I think that cornstarch always has a kind of funny flavor to it. Some people describe it as chalky, or I kind of think of it as rubbery or kind of chemically. Anyway, it's not a really big deal, and it goes away after you cook it for a while. One thing I like about the cornstarch roux versus the cornstarch slurry is that the roux version is more opaque. Normally, cornstarch thickened sauces are kind of clear. I would guess because cornstarch has so little protein in it. And if you're trying to make gravy, clear gravy is kind of weird. Let's try something else. This is potato starch, very common in US grocery stores. If it's not next to the cornstarch, it might be in a kosher food section. Jews aren't supposed to eat grains at Passover, so potato starch. Slurry goes in, that thickens at a way lower temperature, and it is clear as glass. It also doesn't have any funny flavor, totally tasteless. People say that you shouldn't bring potato starch to a full boil because that'll cause it to break down quickly. If you cook any starch long and hot enough, those glucose chains will start to break apart, and then water molecules fall out of the web. The sauce thins out again. But I boiled this for a very long time, adding water to compensate for evaporation, and I didn't really observe any breakdown. I did the same thing with my cornstarch too. I boiled it hard for like 20 minutes. Nothing seemed to thin out. But even if it did, you could just mix in a little bit more slurry to compensate. I think a lot of the differences between different food starches that you read about are really only an issue when you're making food at a commercial or industrial scale, when very tiny differences can multiply into huge differences. When you're cooking at home, things are just way less sensitive and you can easily compensate for stuff. Okay, now things get interesting when we try making a roux out of the potato starch. Browned potatoes taste really good, so I'm betting this is going to taste really good, and indeed, the resulting sauce is delicious. It's still a little unnervingly clear, but man, that tastes really good. We get very similar results from rice flour. Again, a pretty widely available item. It's not an isolated starch, it's just ground up white rice. Slurry goes in, that has to come to a good boil before it thickens, and it's slightly more opaque, probably because it's a flour. There's stuff in there other than just starch. Totally neutral flavor, but when we make the roux with rice flour, we let it brown a little bit, whisk in the broth, and that is, again, delicious. No surprise there, right? Rice that has been browned always tastes good, and I like that this version is not as translucent as the potato starch gravy. That's good gravy. Let's run through some other starches real quick. Here's tapioca, a starch extracted from the tuber known as cassava or yucca. In the slurry goes, very nice clear sauce, but I think it has kind of an unpleasant slimy texture on the tongue. It's also reputed to do weird things when you stir it a lot while cooking. It kind of clumps up. Not a fan. Tapioca is often used in desserts like fruit pie fillings. It is reputed to freeze and thaw really well. It's also reputed to stand up to acid really well. Acid can break down starches and thin them out. Now, is that danger relevant to sauce making? Well, if we put some vinegar and a pinch of sugar into this gravy, you have the base of like half of the gloopy sauces that you know and love from Chinese American style restaurants. Pretty tasty stuff. I tried making the same sauce with cornstarch, which is reputed to be easily broken down by acid, and I noticed no such problems. Maybe a savory sauce just isn't acidic enough to break anything down. And if the sauce did thin out, you could just put in more slurry. Cornstarch, very popular in Chinese American restaurants. Here's arrowroot starch. I think that the dried product has this weird minty smell, but the sauce thickened with the slurry is nice and clear and has a neutral flavor. People say that arrowroot sauces don't reheat well. They break down easily. Well, let's try pouring this off, refrigerating it for a while, and then reheating it in the microwave. I notice no thinning at all. In fact, it's nice that it reheats smooth. When you reheat sauces made with wheat flour or cornstarch, I often find that I can't get them smooth again, no matter how hot I get them. This is the cornstarch thickened sauce. Really gloppy and jelly-like, even though it's really hot. Not nice. Arrowroot has another bad reputation, which is that it does weird things in dairy. I'm just thickening some milk with arrowroot slurry, and indeed, it has a super weird slimy texture. No good. Alright, so those are the big root, tuber, and grain starches. Let's experiment with some more exotic stuff. This is xanthan gum. I bought this down at my normal grocery store the other day. It is a very popular additive in industrial prepared foods. It's not technically a starch, it's another kind of polysaccharide made by fermenting sugars with a particular kind of bacteria. First I tried making a slurry with it, and that did not work at all. It clumped up the second it hit the water in the jar. The package suggests mixing it in with an oil slurry instead, and indeed, xanthan gum disperses very easily and smoothly into fat. You gotta give it a few minutes to gel up, but then a tiny amount of it has incredible thickening power, and that sauce has a really pleasant, smooth mouthfeel. Xanthan gum is often used in ice cream for that nice, smooth mouthfeel it gives. I figured because it disperses so well in fat, maybe it would work well in a roux. Yes, I made xanthan gum roux. And the resulting gravy had a totally different texture. Chalky, powdery, gross. Couldn't tell you why that happened, but don't do it. One thing I can tell you about xanthan gum is that you don't have to get it hot. It gels at virtually any temperature. I'll show you. That's room temperature broth, scatter in some xanthan gum, it clumps up really bad in water. But if you stir it around and then let it sit for a few minutes, it thickens up without any cooking at all. Now, I've seen so-called molecular gastronomy chefs do this and then either try to blend out those lumps with an immersion blender or strain them out. But remember that xanthan gum does dissolve very smoothly in fat. There, you can see why this stuff is a very popular thickener in pre-packaged salad dressings. We'll mix that oil into the broth, let it sit for a few minutes, and it gels right up. It looks kind of gritty, like applesauce, but it tastes smooth. Now, watch this. I'm going to get it really hot in the microwave, and the texture is exactly the same. That is exciting. When you thicken a sauce with a starch, the viscosity varies tremendously depending on the sauce's temperature. That's why when you make, say, a pot pie, you gotta let it cool a long time before you scoop it out. Otherwise, the sauce will just fall right off the other ingredients and run out all over the plate. If you thickened your sauce with xanthan gum, it would be the same thickness regardless of whether it was piping hot or lukewarm. That's awesome, so this is something that I'm going to need to experiment with more down the road. One more experiment though now, agar-agar.
Call me Agar.
This is a mixture of a polysaccharide and a pectin derived from algae. It's used in packaged foods a lot, and it's also a vegan replacement for gelatin, which comes from animals. Agar powder dissolves really easily into water. You do not have to make a slurry with it. And when you bring it to a boil, the sauce has this texture of a reduced meat stock, more kind of unctuous than thick. But let's try the Heston Blumenthal trick. Heston boils in some agar, then he puts the stuff into a jug and chills it. Now it's like a very stiff jello, but unlike jello, it is heat resistant. That will not melt when you get it hot again. So to turn it into a sauce, Heston busts it up with a stick blender. And that looks like regurgitated dog food. And the texture is repulsive. A foam made up of tiny little rubber beads. Thinning it out with more broth does not help. Sorry, Heston, I think I did it wrong. Come to think of it, when I saw him do this on one of his shows, he was doing it with a dairy-based sauce, and I've read that agar reacts differently with dairy. I might have also just used way too much. More experimentation is needed there, but I hope you'll find my more successful experiments here to be useful to you. I think the big takeaway here is that there are lots of food starches and they all work. But since Thanksgiving is coming up here in the States, I'll just stress again that if you need to make a gluten-free gravy, you can try making your roux with rice flour or potato starch. I'd do the rice flour because it's more opaque. That makes a really delicious gravy. Nobody is going to miss the wheat.